Welcome to Beyond Fight or Flight, a series from the Center for Healthy Churches. If you have people, you have differences. And sometimes those differences create tension. Our hope is to help you build a safer space for hard conversations, moving from reaction to discernment, from anxiety to grounded presence, and from division to trust building. Wherever your church is right now, we're here to help you take the next faithful step. Let's get started.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Matt Cook, and I'm the director of the Center for Healthy Churches. I'd like to welcome you to this web series called Beyond Fight or Flight. Our hope is to give you some wisdom, some help in the midst of what can be some challenging circumstances. This is the third of these web series that we've completed. The first one was about pastoral transitions. The second one was about visioning and strategic planning. This one is about conflict, everybody's favorite topic, right? And a little bit about congregational identity too, and how those two things fit together. Our hope is to give you a little bit of practical wisdom if you find yourself in the midst of disagreement within your congregation. We're assuming you didn't wake up this morning and say, hey, let me go looking for something online to help me understand church conflict better. You're probably watching this because either you are in the midst of it or you've experienced it recently and you want to be able to handle those circumstances better. And the good news is I have some really good conversation partners to help me with that. First of all, let me introduce our panel to you this morning. Dr. Ed McLeod is the recently retired pastor of the First Presbyterian Church of Raleigh, North Carolina. In addition to his work at First Pres in Raleigh, he also served in a variety of capacities, helping kind of congregations across his region, including in conflict work. So, Dr. McLeod, Ed, good to have you with us this morning. Michelle Snyder is a member of our team, licensed clinical social worker. She brings kind of a clinician's background to this work, in addition to having an MDiv as well. Michelle does a lot of different things for congregations, and conflict work is one of them. So, Michelle, it is great to have you with us this morning. Dr. David Brubaker is the recently retired dean of the School of, I'm going to get it right, of Social Sciences and Professions at Eastern Mennonite University, an author who has written on this topic. David, we're really, really glad to have you with us this morning. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Reginald Wells, the pastor of the Falling Run Baptist Church in Fayetteville, North Carolina. Reginald is an author as well. And Baptists don't have bishops, but what we do have are people that when things go sideways, pastors get those calls and come in and provide that wisdom, and Reginald is one of those people in Baptist life in his part of the world. So, Reginald, it's good to have you with us as well.
Thank you, Matt.
So, what we're going to focus on in this particular episode is, the title of this episode is If You've Got People, You've Got Tension. We say that to say that in congregational systems, right, there's going to be disagreement. In some ways, that's actually a healthy thing. If we all think exactly alike, there's a really good chance that we're not all that we should be as God's people. All throughout Scripture, there's all kinds of examples in there about how our differences are actually something that God can use to make us better and help us better able to pursue God's will together and carry out the mission of the church. But difference sometimes becomes disagreement, and disagreement sometimes becomes conflict. We want to differentiate those two things a little bit today. We want to talk about the line that exists between when disagreement happens in your church, which can actually be a healthy thing, and when we go beyond disagreement into conflict, where things can very easily escalate and emotions can get high and the system can become toxic. Our hope is to give you some skills today for kind of understanding the difference between those two things. And if you find yourself crossing that line from disagreement into conflict, about ways that you might de-escalate as well. So good to have everybody this morning. David, I want to start with you. So you've probably done more of this work than anyone. You've written about it. So help our viewers understand the relationship between disagreement and conflict in a congregation, and also help them get a general sense of what to look for and be mindful of in their congregation.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. So back in 1989, I did a 5-day training with Speed Lease, who at the time was the senior consultant for the Alban Institute. And it was about consulting with conflicted churches, but I was introduced to the Lee's 5-point scale to analyze or assess conflict in a congregation and have found it a very useful tool. And I know all of us use it in different ways. But it corresponds to the EF1 to EF5 measure that we use to monitor tornadoes and indicate how destructive they can become at the upper level. So, level one, which is simply a problem to solve, means that two individuals are working on a project of some sort. They might be pastoring together in a congregation, and problems inevitably come up, but the two individuals have a respectful relationship and they're working together. They want to solve the problems, and 9 times out of 10, they do. If the problem is not solved through those normal mechanisms, it can escalate to level two, where it becomes a disagreement. Still focused on the problem itself or on the issues, but often with a little more tension in the relationship between the two individuals. Disagreement can be healthy, often is, and particularly if we learn how to invite disagreement as leaders so that make it safe for people to disagree. But if the disagreement is not resolved, it can escalate to the third level, where he called it a contest. We would refer to it as a conflict, where the shift that's so critical is it goes from being focused on issues to being focused on people. So if you and I, Matt, were the two individuals in this situation, I would start to believe certain things about you and why you're so obstinate that we're unable to reach an agreement. And I would probably complain, at least to my spouse and maybe to others, about the difficulty of working with you. You perhaps would do the same thing if you were in a level three conflict. By level four, and this is where we don't want to go in a congregation, but we can if we don't intervene earlier. He called it a fight flight. And by level four, we're basically seeing people who are concluding either they need to go or I need to go. And so factions start to form in the congregation. And it's not focused on issues, even though people will be talking about various issues, and there will often be an identified issue that we're focused on. But in fact, there's deeper underlying issues that aren't always named. Level five, which is very rare, I've seen it 5 times in the last 40 years out of more than 100 organizations. Level five, he called intractable. We might call it a holy war. It's when people have concluded that not only are their opponents up to no good, but they are evil and need to be destroyed. And we see this play out in the world scene, conflicts such as Israel and Palestine. And what's most important is that we deal with things at level one and level two when it's a problem to solve or a disagreement, and not permit it to get to level three, four, and five.
So that's a fantastic overview. And by the way, we recommend Speed Lee's book to you. If you're a pastor trying to understand how this works in your system, that's a great resource. So we want to point you in that direction. Michelle, I want to give you an opportunity to take that one step further. So your background's in social work. So what's taking place on an individual level in these kinds of moments? What individual dynamics are different people with different life experiences bringing to the table in terms of how they approach these moments of problems to solve, disagreements, and then going beyond disagreement into actual conflict?
Yeah, there's a couple things that came to mind. Actually, David, before we turned on the camera, you said something about when you've learned most about conflict. Can you say that again?
Yeah, so I've been working with congregations and other faith-based organizations for about 40 years, and my dissertation research was on change and conflict in congregations. But what I said was I've learned more about disagreement and conflict from being married for 45 years than I have from either of those other two things.
Yeah, yeah, thank you. Um,
Hmm.
yeah, I thought it was so helpful because spent I spent more than a decade as a therapist and have done a lot of marriage counseling, taught marriage counseling, and I think marriage counseling principles are actually some of the most helpful, as well as family systems theory. Group conflict takes on some other kind of elements and dynamics, but at the end of the day, group conflict is made up of people who are in that conflict. And there are a couple things I think about. Matt, you just started by saying like it's love weekend and yet we're talking about conflict. But the fact of the matter is, I think that's really relevant because people are in conflict because they love deeply, right? They're engaged with people that they care about enough to be mad at. They love things that feel like sacred cows and worth kind of fighting for. And so I think love is like deep at the heart of what we experience when we're talking about conflict. There's like two things I think about. So um, there's attribution given to several people for this quote, but Ron Heifetz often has said people don't resist change, they resist loss. And so when we're dealing with conflict at the interpersonal level or the group level, I do think asking ourselves, where are the losses here that people are sort of leaning into and kind of drilling down on or doubling down on? Um, Also, a family systems principle is that anxiety is what keeps systems stuck. And so when we start thinking about like where are the anxieties, I often have said in therapy, let's just change the word anxiety to fear. Like, what are you afraid of? Um, and it's not completely synonymous, but it's useful enough, a parallel. And so when we think about what people are dealing with here is loss and they're dealing with anxiety, like how do you break through that? Um, and what we find in one-on-one work is a lot of conflict is not going to be resolvable. I'm not going to change the fact that I think that we need to have green carpet instead of blue carpet, and I'm going to never change my mind about that. But so sometimes conflict is like getting resolving it by getting you to change your mind is not the point, but listening to each other's stories, storytelling is like sort of at the heart of how we break through. Actually, I quote this a lot, but there's a marriage counseling researcher named John Gottman who says that 69% of what we fight about is unresolvable conflict that we're never gonna change. And so the point is not to change the conflict, but it's to hear each other. I also think that, you've got this kind of, I want to hear you. And as I hear you, um, it's going to make me more curious because I love you and because I want to know what drives you and because I can hear the heart and the passion and the fear and the loss and and maybe the regret and maybe the trauma that you bring to this conversation. And that's important. The other thing is we don't bring our best selves to conflict often. David's talking about 4 and 5 and I'm doubling down and now I've demonized you. There's a marriage counseling principle. John Gottman also says he talks about the difference between positive sentiment override and negative sentiment override. So positive sentiment override is that when I feel good about somebody and I feel good about the relationship and they say a neutral statement, I presume that they meant something positive. Is that a new dress from my spouse? I hear as nice dress. And I say, oh, thanks. If we're in conflict and I'm angry at you, and he says, is that a new dress? I say, why are you always criticizing me about money? Yeah, like I'm allowed to go shopping, right? And so like we bring that to conflict. And when I'm sitting across from another and I presume the worst, um, that plays out in conflict. So I think there's sort of we need to hear each other and we need to be held accountable for how we treat each other. We need to sort of be held accountable for how I show up in this conversation. And oftentimes I behave badly and I need to be reminded that there are certain principles for what is okay to do and not do, what is okay to say and not say. How do we kind of agree to be our best self in this conversation? So interpersonally, I think you're dealing with loss. I think you're dealing with anxiety, and I think that you're dealing oftentimes with bad behavior and presumptions that show up as a result of all of those things.
So, Ed, Reginald, you both watched this play out as pastors and also with the congregations that you've been brought in to serve and to help as advisors, providing wise counsel from the outside. So, when the temperature is rising, what are you most often seeing that is causing or contributing to that conflict? Ed, let's start with you.
Uh, at at its basic level, I think what I often see is there's either a lack of communication and or a lack of trust in the system. Um, and just a few kind of specific examples of where I've seen that. When a personnel change has to be made, um, everybody on a church staff has a constituency, maybe big, maybe small, but if a change has to be made, they feel that deeply, and because personnel matters are often have to be held confidentially, you can't fully explain, and so that's where trust comes in. If there's no trust in the system, all sorts of bad assumptions are made. Another thing is when significant changes are made without doing a good job of making the case of why this change fits our mission, why it will help us thrive, why it will help us be better sustainable. I've got a friend who's come up with, I don't know if it's his theory, but um, he says in his congregation, he has these leaders who may not be official leaders, but they are leaders in the church, and he calls them grounding stakes. And when something big is coming up, he goes to them and says, this is about to happen. We can't go to everybody in the congregation, but he tries to make the case with these grounding stakes why this is an important change, so that when the change is made and the anxiety enters the system, these grounding stakes can say, this sounds pretty smart to me, or I can see the value in this, and it sort of diffuses the anxiety. The third thing that comes to mind, then I'm going to let Reginald add his wisdom, is when and this is existential for me, is when a pastor does not yet have enough capital to make a change. Trust is the only currency we have, and it's good to have a good bank balance of trust. And so often I've seen, and often it's been me, who tried to make a change before I had enough trust to make a change. And so, but in a nutshell, communication and trust go a long way in moving us past hard disagreements, but the lack of communication and trust can just be fuel to the fire.
Can I just name?
Go ahead, Michelle. Go ahead.
And I love that line. I've just played it in my head like 10 times since you've been talking. When a change has to be made, they feel that deeply. And I wonder about how much of what we're dealing with generally, I mean, how much conflict is about people not wanting to feel the hurt, people not wanting to feel the loss, people like what the role is of being willing to feel a thing deeply, being willing to hurt, being willing to grieve, being willing to, we say in therapy, a lot of therapy ends up being grief work, right? And so I appreciate that line.
Guy Sales wrote for us a couple of years back, talking about the need for lament as a congregational practice in the 21st century, because there is so much change, and there is so much, the potential for so much loss, right? It's a disorienting moment. And if you don't learn to give healthy expression to your grief, healthy expression to how loss is impacting you, then there's a really good chance you're going to deal with that in unhealthy.
Yeah.
And I just heard you say there is so much change, but like if you swapped out the word loss for change, like with every change comes loss, there is so much loss, and when we don't name it as loss, we double down. I don't know. I think that through more, but I appreciate that juxtaposition of change and loss and
Reginald, take that a little deeper for us in your experience.
Something that Ed talked about, trust. Stephen Covey wrote the book, The Speed of Trust. And in that, as people starting to trust you over time, they allow you to change things. I think, again, some younger pastors go into situations trying to assume power before it's given to them. Their name is on the marquee or on the bulletin. They are pastor in name only, but not in practice. So I think that's very key. Just keeping with something that Ed talked about, loss. I remember being called into a situation because they were divided over worship, the worship style, the change. Are we going to do tradition versus contemporary, hymns versus praise team? That's what they told me on the surface. That's what I was told initially when I was invited to come in. But as I sat listening, I realized the worship debate was not the real conflict. Underneath it really was grief. The long-term pastor, the longtime pastor, the church had lost a longtime pastor, and the new pastor for them represented change. And some members felt unheard. Others felt like their history was being erased. The music was really not the problem. I discovered as I sat there, the problem was unprocessed transition and broken trust.
Mm.
They could not process this transition. They went from their long-term pastor to this young guy who came in, and so they looked at it was just unprocessed. It was unprocessed transition and broken trust, and so and I've seen that pattern over and over. Sometimes the conflict is labeled as a budget issue. Sometimes it's a staff change. Sometimes it's generational tension, but most often it's fueling the heat is one of the fewer deeper things. I think Ed talked about that. Poor communication, unclear expectations, unaddressed hurt. And we go back to that again. And power and control struggles. I think David talked about that a little bit. Or fear, fear of losing influence, fear of losing identity. And when people feel unheard, unseen, uncertain, the temperature rises quickly. And that another thing, and I'll move on, that I've noticed is that conflict escalates when conversations stop happening directly. Often I've discovered that instead of them happening in a meeting, they happen on the parking lot, in group texts, these side meetings. And once people begin talking about each other instead of to each other, trust erodes. And when trust erodes, everything feels threatened. So I think it is very important that people need to feel present in the moment. That tension is relevant. And, pastors have to, their silence can also contribute to tension. When pastors feel like, it's just going to go away. If I don't say anything about it, it's going to go away. And we all know, I hope that it's, and I've been guilty of that. If I don't say anything about it, maybe it'll calm down. Maybe I can just pray it away. But leadership requires having to deal with change, having to deal with conflict. And no one really likes conflict. Some people are conflict avoidance. I know I have some pastor friends, we talked often, and they will tell you, I like preaching. I don't like staff meetings. I don't like going to staff meetings. I don't like congregational meetings because of the fear that I have to deal with something. So I think sometimes the pastors can be guilty of fueling that by not addressing the conflict that's going on in the church. Yeah.
Can I tell a story, just a quick story about that,
Yeah,
Matt?
sure, go for it.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm thinking about that, like you don't have enough capital in the system and kind of knowing like the trust built up. Somebody famous in these spaces said that leadership is disappointing people at a rate that they can absorb. Does anybody know who said that?
I
You
think
did.
that's Heifetz, actually.
I always give credit to Heifetz if I don't know who
Yeah.
else it is. I just say it was probably Ron Heifetz.
I've used that quote often.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
I've
So
heard Matt use it. I've heard Matt
yeah,
use it.
it's great. But yeah, I worked with a church once, small kind of rural church with all those dynamics that came with that. And there was a pastor who started his first. He was a seminary intern there, became their pastor, married a daughter of the church, and retired from there. So let's say 45 or 50 years. And they hired after he left a 32-year-old like beautiful female single pastor. And she came and I think she'd been there about 9 months, and she went from a black and white bulletin cover to a color, like she added color to the bulletin cover, and it just blew up. Like she was like, "What is happening? All I did was add color to their bulletin." And I remember saying to her, "You are so much change. The fact that you are standing in that pulpit and their
Right.
pastor, their
Right.
the pastor is not, that like it's more than they can handle.
Right.
You think that's small, you think it's tiny, but when you kind of drill down on like how much trust do you have in the system? How, like, what is the loss that you represent? How what is the disappointment of this moment for them, and how how do you kind of recognize that you needed more capital than you had in order to do that? Yeah. Sometimes things can seem really small,
Yeah.
but but knowing what is the rate that people can absorb, knowing
Right.
like that's a pastoral sensibility that's super important.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I mean,
That's good.
let's camp out in that idea for a second. So we've go back to what Heifetz said about the idea that people don't really fear change; they fear loss, right? Like I would say, you can change any number of things in a congregational system, and if people don't perceive that as you taking something from them, oftentimes they can even get behind it and applaud it in some ways,
Hmm.
right? Like
Hmm.
if you're gonna change something that more effectively enables a congregation to carry out its mission, and people don't personally feel any sense of loss about that, then they actually might pat you on the back and say, "Good job, Pastor.
Right.
Good job." But but the minute that they start to feel like they're saying goodbye to something, especially something that they really are in love with, something that represents the enduring values, that plays out differently. So I want to give you kind of an opportunity, all of you, an opportunity to, or actually Ed and Reginald and Michelle, an opportunity to talk about how you've seen that play out in the congregations that you've worked with. Ed, let's start with you.
My view has always been that very few changes need to happen immediately. Um, there, but changes, a lot of changes can happen over time, slowly, um, and accomplish the same thing while people um, have gotten on board. And it's the notion that I show up at a church and I've got to change the order of worship because I don't like the other order of worship. I'm just not sure there's much wisdom in that. My own example of that, when I came to my most recent church, was a long time ago now. Over a period of about a year and a half, we completely changed the worship service, but we did it slowly, incrementally, and with talks about it. And I think if you would have asked anybody, they would have said, "Oh yeah, this is the order of service we've had forever." But it wasn't. It wasn't. It just we took the time to try to communicate and to demonstrate that we can be trusted with the holy things because we think they're holy too. Um, so that would be my response.
All right, Michelle, what about you? How have you seen that play out in congregations?
Yeah, I've seen lots of specific examples of that. I think where my head was sitting that got me a little distracted was Matt when you said like you can probably make lots of changes in the church, like you could like as long as people don't experience them as loss. It strikes me that I see lots of leaders, lots of pastors who who will say like I don't understand what happened. We like changed this and this and this and this and it was fine and then this thing blew up. And they're like they see that like oh, I can get away with this. I can get away with, and then like they hit a brick wall and they're like, what just happened? I think that the wisdom, the wisdom particularly around David's five, the Speed Lee's five, but what David talked about there is I think a pastoral wisdom that hits that wall and asks better questions and says, what did I just step on here? Like,
Mm.
and how do I back away from it, not back away from the change that I might think is really worth making, but how do I ask like where's the loss? What is the resistance? Who is, I don't know, etc., etc. Where's the grief that needs named and attuned to? Most recently, in last week, I was talking to a pastor who had this like there's like an organ in the narthex that nobody has touched in the 5 years that she's been there. And it's taking up prime real estate where they could do something pretty meaningful with the space around a new and emerging ministry. And she inadvertently should not have went to this person and said, what would you think if we donated that organ to a church that really needed it? And this person started behaving badly, said no, but then went and called all of her friends and all of her allies. And before you know it, now you've got it circling back around to the pastor. Why are you trying to change trying to change the church and you're just trying to destroy us? And I mean, it just went from 0 to 100 in 3 or 4 minutes. And what she did, to her credit, was a real like she stood up publicly and apologized. I overstepped. I that was a board level conversation, and I thought it was simple, and it wasn't, and I'm sorry that I did that. Also, here are here are some things people have said to me, and she didn't name names or anything, but she said people have said some really hard and some really hurtful things. They said that I'm trying to destroy the church. They said that and honestly, I I hope that's not true. I'm sorry for the ways that what I did made people. So she just like addressed that head on at the level of the loss, at the level of the grief. Um, and you know, I think one of the things about conflict is how we let each other treat each other. And so norming, you know, so you're going to have the outlier who's just going to behave badly sometimes. And it's the responsibility of the system to call that into question. And so what she did was some education with the whole body. I mean, it's a church of 12 people, right? Like, so you wouldn't do this in a church of 1,000, but it's a very small church. And so she could do it in that way, but she sort of invited them all to say, what are we going to, you know, first of all, here's what I'm going to do different, and here's how I'm going to be different. And I think she took what could have become level 4 very quickly and brought it back down. To Reginald's point, we stop, you know, conflict really takes off whenever we stop talking to each other. And she forced the conversation, took the leadership, modeled good practices, and forced the conversation. And it worked. It did. It de-escalated it.
Reginald, what about you? Have you seen that play out in congregational settings?
I had a situation where I was called in. The church was known for decades as being a strong preaching, teaching church. New pastor comes in. You know, he didn't abandon the word per se. You know, he brought the emphasis on community involvement, and he wanted the church to be more visible in the community. Now on paper, you know, that doesn't sound like conflict. Word and witness. On paper, it didn't sound like conflict, but you had long-term members, um, long-standing members who, you know, felt like it was shifting their identity. You know, it was not necessarily a program change. They felt like we are not who we used to be. And I heard that, you know, we are not who we used to be. And the moment that feeling surfaced, the temperature took off. I mean, immediately. I can just remember sitting in that meeting. I'm thinking, you know, worship and word. That's a great mantra. That's something you could put out there. But and the guy did not abandon his teaching. His emphasis just shifted to, hey, we're in this community. We need to engage the community, because what was happening, persons they had community around them that they were not affecting. These were persons who were coming in from other places. So his thing was, we can continue to preach and teach, but we need to have some community visibility. And the moment he said that, people who had been there a while just felt like they lost their identity. And I think David or someone said, when a person loses his or her identity, that's when, you know, the conflict arises. You know, people were saying, we're becoming too social. We're drifting. You know, this is not the church I joined 20 years ago. Yeah. And so I saw some resistance. People were really resistant to this outreach. And it was a fear of losing the core values that shaped their spiritual lives. That was the key. They were not thinking about those who could possibly be impacted. The conflict that they were experiencing, or they voiced, was because what was going to be happening would threaten their spiritual lives. They felt like, look, what drew me here is not what I don't think was going to draw these other people. And the pastor's emphasis was, we can have word and witness. And so people were just very resistant. It was just to me, I thought it was a no-brainer. And so when you know, people really started to express their resistance. I've learned that when people believe the soul of their church has been altered, even if the perception is not entirely accurate, they react strongly. Identity is deeply emotional for some people. It is tied to, I discovered, it's tied to memory, the memory of what they had. It's tied to sacrifice. You know, I've been here. I came 25 years ago when there were 30 members. I helped to grow it to where it is now. So you're going to bring these people in. They have no sacrifice. They have no skin in the game. They have no blood and sweat and tears here. And then legacy. legacy. You know, people are deeply tied. Identity is deeply tied to legacy, to memory, to sacrifice, and belonging. We've coexisted here 25 years, just like we have with the word only. And there's a possibility if you start talking about witnessing, we're going to get some new people. How they're going to fit in, it's going to become us versus them. And I want to just close with this. One of my mentors said something years ago to me that I've really, going back to something Ed said. There's some things you can teach people to grasp in order for change. There's some things that people, they just catch it. There's some things that are taught and there's some things that are caught. So I think when we're talking about changing some things, we got to teach. There's some things that people can just catch by just watching and assimilating to what's going on around them. Yeah.
So, if you're listening close, you probably heard several of the greatest hits when it comes to conflict, right? The things that tend to show up the most. But there's one we haven't touched on yet, one that's been climbing the charts here recently, and that is around, especially as it relates to identity and conflict, and that is the question of political polarization. So we are seeing that increasingly show up in a lot of congregational conflict. So, David, you've actually written a book about this phenomenon. So, what is particularly challenging for congregations about political polarization and that particular set of tensions? And what would you say to congregational leaders who might be in the midst of that particular disagreement, that particular set of tensions, and that particular shade of conflict?
So, Matt, if you're willing, I'd like to highlight a couple of principles that came out of the colleague discussion that we just had on change and conflict and then transition into polarization.
Okay, great.
One of the things that I've noticed over the years is that leaders have to earn the right to make change, and they earn the right to make change by listening. And it came through in all three of the stories that we heard of people prematurely rushing into a change process or not consulting broadly. So the whole idea of having grounding stakes, Ed, I really appreciated that concept that we're checking in with people to ground a change process. And then secondly, the importance of an incremental change process rather than a rushed or hasty process, which tends to upset people even more. People can absorb change, but they have an absorption capacity, and a congregation has an absorption capacity. So we don't want to exceed that capacity. So regarding polarization and identity, one thing that struck me about 10 years ago, I was talking with a pastor who was dealing with different political perspectives in his congregation and was unsure how to manage it. And he said, I particularly am concerned about how people talk with each other. They're talking in ways that they never would have 20 years ago. And there are personal attacks that I just don't remember seeing earlier in my career. And we talked about it, and I was exploring with him a little bit where this comes from. And he finally said, I only have an hour a week with these folks. Talk radio has them 3 hours a day. And so our identity is being shaped by external forces in ways that we haven't fully taken in. And I'm indebted to Liliana Mason, who in 2018 wrote a book that was titled Uncivil Agreement. But the subtitle is How Politics Became Our Identity. How Politics Became Our Identity. So when I was growing up in the church 50, 60 years ago, I remember a very clear call to center our identity in Jesus, in Christ, and what that means, and the message and the life of Christ. That message is still being taught, albeit for an hour or two on Sunday mornings. But what people are being shaped by even more is the kind of discourse that is happening in the broader society. So the polarization that is external to our context comes internal, it becomes internal to our congregations. Now, how do we deal with that? I'd love to engage all of us in that conversation. But one of the most important things we can do is to attempt to recenter identity in Jesus rather than in any political party or figure. And the other is, in my opinion, not to be completely nonpartisan, but perhaps to be multi-partisan, to recognize that there is truth coming from a variety of perspectives, and we can acknowledge that truth without necessarily buying into only one discourse. So for myself, although I'm more inclined to one political party than the other, I recognize that there are truths that come from the entire spectrum, and that what we most want to do is to model civil agreement and civil disagreement. So to agree with people when we can agree with them, and to disagree when we must, to not be afraid to disagree. Going back to the 5 levels of conflict, and we'll be talking about process later in this series, there is a particular process that's appropriate for each one of those 5 levels. And so if it's a problem to solve, dialogue is very appropriate. It works well. If it becomes a disagreement, maybe we need negotiation. Maybe you and I, Matt, need to sit down, have lunch together, and talk through the differences that we've both identified. If it goes to level 3, a contest or a conflict, we often need a mediator. We need a third party to help us refocus on the issues and defocus on each other. And if it's level 4, we need a consultant. We need someone from outside the congregation to come into that system with a very clear process and to help de-escalate so that people can talk appropriately with each other. If it's level 5, there will be significant fallout. And at that point, usually an authority figure is needed, which exists in some denominations and less in others. But we need someone who's able to say, stop it, this is unacceptable, it needs to change. And maybe we need to go to separate corners for a while until we de-escalate it. So we can deal with conflict in those different ways, but the more we deal with it at levels 1 and 2, the less we'll have to deal with it at 3, 4, and 5.
So we've covered a lot of ground in this conversation, and honestly, we could have gone an hour further and we could have followed up on a lot of the things that we've talked about, but don't have unlimited time today. I want to finish off with some very practical nuggets. So the people that are listening, and probably in some level of disagreement in their congregation, they can have some takeaways. So I want to give each of you kind of an opportunity to kind of lean in with that. To end, I want to end with a little bit of wisdom and end with a little bit of hope. So if you could give, kind of a 1 to 2 sentence piece of quick advice to congregational leaders who are likely watching this because their congregations are experiencing some of these dynamics, what would you say? So Reginald, let me start with you.
Thank you for that, Matt. It's been wonderful just spending time with my colleagues today. I had an answer that I was going to give earlier. I thought as I was listening, but it's kind of changed. Um, One thing I would say, if you're dealing with conflict in your church, slow everything down. Slow everything down. When emotions are high, speed makes it worse. Quick votes, fast changes, sudden announcements, those things feel threatening. Slowing the pace communicates we're not rushing past you. I've been accused often of, why are you taking so long to move on that? I've learned that you have to slow it down, read the temperature, and just let people feel like they are a part of what you're doing. Because if you should have these quick votes and quick announcements, people feel like, look, you're looking past me. You don't care what I think, and I'm going to get with my buddies over here, and we're gonna stop it altogether. So I've learned my takeaway is just slow things down and communicate more accurately and correctly and clearly. Thank you.
Michelle, what about you?
Yeah, I'm been mulling on kind of Reginald and David said in two different ways. What they were talking about were binaries, and I think binaries are always problematic. Um, this idea of like tension. I'm part of an organization, and what we have done is name the things we hold in tension. Instead of naming our core values, we've
Mm.
named what are the 5 or 6 things we hold in tension because both of them are true. Word and witness are both needed. Um, every party has things to say that are worth hearing, and I think the takeaway for leaders is that when we start to hear some of those things, when we start to see ourselves talking about the good guys and the bad guys, or the right side and the wrong side, when we have people who flare up and it doesn't make any sense to us, I think we need to stop, as Reginald said, slow down and ask, what am I not hearing? What stories don't yet make sense to me? Where are the losses that are invisible to me? what's this anxiety represent, and try to go deeper and get underneath it. Yeah.
Ed, what about you?
Well, I'm going to speak primarily to Presbyterians in the world who might be paying attention to this. What I would say, particularly to a Presbyterian pastor, is one of the great resources we have is we're not on an island. We have a session to help us make decisions, to help us think through things. Um, as I always say to my elders, y'all are just as ordained as I am. And so taking time to deliberate about changes, it helps us from getting out on an island where we decide by ourselves we want to move an organ. And so, and the second thing I would say from our tradition, when we are ordained, when you as a Presbyterian minister are ordained, you make a promise to work for the peace, purity, and unity of the church. Mm. And there's a certain beauty about the trifold nature of that. You know, if you just had to work for the peace of the church, you would never try anything new. If you only wanted to work for the purity of the church, all you'd have to do is get rid of the sinners. If you only had to work for the unity of the church, you would just find out something that everybody likes and only do that. But we are challenged to work for the peace, purity, and unity of the church all the time, and sometimes and to hold those in some tension, but to see that there's beauty and wisdom in all three of those. And so, to my Presbyterian colleagues who might be listening to this and pondering this, holding fast to that ordination promise, I think, is a great resource and support.
David?
So I mentioned the 1989 training with Speed Lease. He had worked with hundreds of congregations, and he said there are two styles of leadership that get a pastor in trouble. And the first won't surprise you. He said it's the authoritarian leader, the pastor who says it's my way or the highway. You either get on board or you get out of the way. But the second, he said, which caused just as many failed pastorates, he described as the undefined minister, the one who says, I don't really have an opinion. I'm just here to shepherd the flock. He said that got pastors in just as much trouble because people knew he or she did have an opinion and was not, for whatever reason, willing to share it. And so the advice was self-define, be clear about who you are and what you believe in appropriate context. Doesn't mean we self-define in every issue, that would be impossible. But there are some times when pastors need to take a clear stand. But in addition to self-defining, stay connected so that we treat our those who may disagree with us with the dignity that they deserve, and we communicate respectfully and appropriately. We're hard on issues, but soft on people. So stay connected with those with whom we disagree, but don't be afraid to self-define, because the failure to self-define can also get you into trouble.
I'll finish up with a story from my own experience. I was very first church I ever pastored was the First Baptist Church of Rosebud, Texas. I mean, what a great name for a town and for a church. And there was a retired pastor in the church, and in my first 6 months there was we were working through an issue, and there was a man who just was in a bad mood. He was in a bad mood, and young pastor, he was making my life hard, and this retired pastor's his name's Adrian Coleman. He pulled me aside and he said, "Matt, I said, I know he's making your life hard, and you don't deserve what he's doing, but let me just give you a little bit of advice." He said, "You know, there's something going on. Almost certainly, there's something going on at home, which is leading to him acting in the way that he is, and causing the conflict that he's causing in our church." And I was a young pastor. That was a new perspective for me. You know, the people who've been doing this for a while, that probably sounds like really good wisdom to you that you've heard before. But the thing that went beyond that though for me was, and that kind of Adrian kind of led me in that direction, was if I could give myself permission to slow down and to understand what was taking place, it changed the way that all of my conversations with that individual was taking place right now. Yeah. Empathy seems to be on trial right now among some people, in the church right now, and I don't understand how anybody could say that empathy is anything other than a Christian virtue. Paul put it this way: rejoice with those who rejoice and mourn with those who mourn. There are things that we disagree on in congregations, but we as congregational leaders can always put ourselves in a position to rejoice with those who are rejoicing and to mourn with those who are mourning. We don't have to own every single thing they think, but what we can do is understand that those are fellow human beings that are experiencing a range of emotions. I certainly think the mourning with those who mourn is probably even a little bit more applicable in this case, and that we have to recognize that we live in a very tumultuous moment. So if I was going to give you some practical advice as a congregational leader, before you try to resolve the issue, make sure you that the person feels seen and the person feels heard. That doesn't necessarily going to solve the issue, but there's a really good chance that that will push you back in the direction down out of the conflict side down into just the simple disagreement side, and give you a basis for continuing to stay in relationship and making it all the way through to the other side. So that's the piece of practical advice that I would give. All right, any final words before we conclude this episode? My thanks to the panel. My thanks to you for watching today. There's going to be several of these that come out in the coming weeks, so we hope that this resource will be useful for you and your congregation. Thank you for your time and attention today, and thanks to the panel. Everybody have a great morning. Bye-bye.
Thank
You and I live in the midst of the most significant season of change in the history of the American church. And disagreement almost always comes along for the ride when changes are taking place. You are going to need both a mindset and a skill set for walking through disagreement in ways that fosters light rather than heat and love rather than anger. We think that this series will help you get started. And if after listening you realize that you need more assistance than a web series can provide, then give us a call. Our mission is to help your church be healthy. We consider it a privilege to walk alongside you.